Hey guys, so in this lecture what we are going to do is we are going to learn forms in React, and of course any web application or any system isn't complete without getting forms done. So what we will see is we'll start with the basic input, then we'll try to have an input in a child component so that we can have components for different functions or form elements that we want to. And then the next thing is we'll try to see different elements, which is like a select box, a text area. So we'll go from there, and then we'll also have a complex form where we'll have multiple inputs taken from the same form in a React component, how you can handle the inputs depending on the type of the component that you're dealing with. So that's for the summary or what we are going to do. Now let's get started with the code. Again, I have cleaned up the code a little and made ready for forms in React. You can definitely start from the start folder, or you can do is you can use the same component that you had in the previous lecture with just some cleaning that you probably coded in that lecture. Again, you can go to the app.js, and that's where we start our coding. Okay. So the first thing let's see is a simple input element, and how we can do it. A simple input element. Let's go to the content. Let's try to create an input here. Let me just give in some enter so that you can see my face on the right. Okay, so input tag. Now input tag will definitely have a value. Let's say equals to my input, and you can also have a placeholder, but if you give a value, the placeholder makes no sense. So let's just give the value, and let's save it and see what happens on the screen. And the page is refreshing, and fantastic, my input is here. Now let's try to display the content of the input out here, but it's very difficult to display it in normal JavaScript or HTML. So what we will do is we'll create a constructor out here, and we will have a state given, which is my input value, and let's say this is my input. So whatever this value is, that will be the state. Now let's try to use that state out here and replace the content of the input field. So this dot state dot my input value. Let's save it. So now what happens is you are reading it from your state variable. Now how will this help when you try to update or change something in the form? I'll show you. So let's try to do an on change on this one. So on change equals to some method. So my input changed. Okay, let's say. Now how will you handle the my input changed? Well, simple. First thing is you need to bind it. So make sure you do that in the constructor. So you do this dot my input change is equal to this dot my input change dot bind, and this. So that way you have already bound. So now you did one on change, then you bind it, it'll give you an error. So let's try to create the function. Let's create the function and save it so the page refreshes correctly. Now all we are going to do in this function is whenever an input comes in, you just need to update the state. So let's say I'll just say this dot set state and change it to my input value. Let's update it to input changed. Okay, so whenever I make a change to my input, the input should update it to my input changed. So let me go here, let me just type in something, and it shows input changed. Very easy, right? But we don't want the input change to be something that we already have in place. So let's first thing do is let's try to display the content of the input as an h4 tag. So what we will do is we will do an h4 tag and try to display what our input says. So this state dot my input value. Now what will happen is rather than replacing the content of the input, we will just show it down there. So whatever is the input, and if I just type it here as a D, it will change to input changed, and this also updates, right? But we don't want that to happen. We don't want our custom input to be entered. We want whatever the user has entered to be updated out here. So whatever the user enters needs to be updated here. How can that be done? Very easily. So what you do is you go here and you pass in an event. So what happens is whenever you have an event, you can access things. So what this event has in store for us, let's see that. So let's do a console log of this event and see what we get in the event. Let's refresh the page, open the console. Okay, let's just type something so that event gets printed. So now you saw that the event got printed, and when the event gets printed, let me take it up a little so that you can see it on the screen. And it has a lot of things. It has target, handler, and so on and so forth. So what we need is first to see what the input target is. So let's try to print e.target, and that's how you can access the particular element that was updated or that was in question. Let's do that. And the target is input changed. You see that? That's the input field. Now you can also get the value for that versus. So let's try to get the value of this particular target. So the way we get the value is we just do a dot value. So let's try to see what the console shows. It should right now just show input change because we have it hard coded to that. It should be inputted D. So whatever you inputted, although after that the input changed. So what we can do is, rather than having input changed hard coded here, we can use this e.target value. So let's just store it in a variable, saying variable item value is equals to this. Let's remove the console, we don't need it any longer. Let's use the item value and put it in here. Let's save it, refresh the page. Let's close the console. Okay, now my input is something awesome. You see that? So whatever I type in the input, it gets updated. And the way I did it is, first I created a state variable for it, which is my input value. I stored the input's value in that particular field. I bound that input value to the value of the input field. So wherever you have the value, instead of the value, you give the state variable that you created. Now on change of this input, you handle a function, and the function, of course, it has to be bind to the class. And once you have the function running, you can just set the state to the new value by accessing the event.target.value. Easy, right? So that was a very simple example of having an input field onto the screen. Now what if this input field is in a child component? How do you handle? How can you make updates to the parent so that the contents get updated, which means the h4 is in the parent whereas the input field is in the child. So let's create quickly a child component for it. So let's say we have a component called my input component. Okay, all this component does it has an input. So let's just copy this input and paste it down there. We don't need the class name, a normal div is good enough. And let's try to use the my input component out here. My input component, and everything should be the same. Although it may not get the state variable because this state variable doesn't exist any longer. So what we can do is we can pass this as a property. So input value is equals to this dot state dot my input value. Now I can use the input value field as a prop and see if the input value comes correctly. And again, it will not work because the input change is not there. Let's remove this for a second. Okay, I have a typo out here. Let's try to fix it. So it's this dot props dot input value, and now we have the input displayed correctly. However, when I click anything or change anything, nothing will happen at this point. You see that? I'm typing something and nothing is happening at this point. The reason being the value is defined and nothing happens on its change. So what we can do is we can do an on change equals to something. Now what this something has to be, this has to come in from the parent. So you can use the same my input changed field, but you need to pass it to the child component. So how you can use this? You can pass the same function. Let's say in the my input field, I call the same function is equals to this dot my function. Now when I pass this function, on change of this, I can say this dot props dot my function name. And what it will do is on change of this, it will call my parent's input change function, which is here. And this will internally call the same function that we intended to. Let's try to see what happens when we try to enter something. You see that? And everything works. So this was another example or how you can move the fields onto separate components and then reuse it from one parent component. So let's say you have a master form, or let's say for example a context page where your first name, middle name, last name, so on and so forth. You can end up creating different components for those and ultimately join them together. So that was a very basic example on how inputs work. We haven't still used it in a form. The next we're going to see is how to use it in a form, but that I will show you in the next video. So I'll see you then. Hey guys, so in this lecture we are going to continue our discussion on the forms, and we've already seen the input component that we just created. Now we will create multiple types of inputs like select box, check box, and probably a text area, and see how it fits into the whole form component. So let's quickly create a component. Let's copy this, let's go down, let's create a simple component for your, let's say, text area. So in that case we will say essay component. So we have the essay component, and now instead of the input I will make this a text area. And of course the value has to be something. So what we will do is we'll quickly create a constructor. In the constructor we will just pass in the value, and let's say it's the starting value once upon a time dot dot dot. That's the starting value for my text area. And what I will do is, rather than this, I'll say state dot value, and on change of it handle change. Okay, and rather than props, let's make sure we do a state. Actually we can just do this dot handle change. Okay, now let's just quickly bind this handle change in the constructor. So this dot handle change is equals to this dot handle change dot bind this. So now that we have the handle change method, let's try to define it. So handle change, and we will have to handle the change in the text area, which is pretty much the same as we did in the previous example where we had the input. So text area is nothing but a type of an input. This dot set state, and of course the brackets, and then say value is equals to whatever is the event's value. So let's just pass in the event, and then let's do a e dot target dot value. So that way we will have the value of whatever is entered into the text area, and then we can also display this value just below the text area. So let's say I have an h4 tag again, open and close, and say this dot state dot value. Let me save it. The text area doesn't show up. I think the problem is the A. It has to be all lowercase because it's one of the HTML components. So let me save that again. Let's hope for the page. Oh, I haven't used the component yet, so let's just use the component out here. Let's say essay component. So now that we have written the essay component, we saved it, and we can see the text area being displayed with the initial value and whatever is displayed here. I was walking and it rained. Probably that's not a very good essay, but you get the point that you can write in anything in the text area and you can handle the input. Now what if we want to implement this in a form and probably want to alert it to the user saying that this is the text that you entered? It's very easy to handle that too. Let's try to handle that by adding a form to it. So rather than a div, let's make this a form, and on submit we will call our own method, which is, let's say, this dot handle submit. Okay, let's close the form tag, and we don't have a button yet, so let's just make sure we give a button too. So button type is equals to submit, and let's just close this button tag. Say submit, then let's just close the button tag. Okay, so that's the form, but this dot handle submit is not yet defined, so let's just go back to our constructor, first bind it and then also define it. So let's just do that. So this dot handle submit is equals to this dot handle submit dot bind, and this. So now that we have bound it, let's try to also handle it. So we handle the submit. The first thing we will do is pass in the event, and then let's make sure we prevent the default. Prevent default. What this does is whatever is supposed to happen on a default submission, it will prevent that action to happen. So e.prevent default will stop it. And just before stopping it, let's make sure we alert it to the user. So whatever is the input we have, which is we can just do target dot, we can just do this dot state dot value. So whatever is the value will get alerted to the user the moment I submit the text. Let's try to do that without any changes. And you can see once upon a time. Let's say once upon a time I was playing, and let's do a submit again. And you can see once upon a time I was playing. So you handled the submit and you also alerted the value to the user on submit of the form. And that's how you can play with any of the fields. So this was just a text area. The next we're going to move is to a select box. So for select box, the way you see is you have select tag, you have options, and one of the option is a selected option. So all you need to make sure is whichever is a selected option has the field as checked. Okay. So let's copy this same SA component, create another component, and let's call this as, let's say, flavor form. So in this case we will have a select box, and probably we'll have certain flavors that we need to select, and based on the user input the particular flavor will be selected. So let's just say value is equals to start with, let's say grapefruit, all lowercase. Okay, this dot change, whatever change has to happen, you need to make sure the state of the value gets updated. Similarly on submit, the value gets printed. Now in the form, rather than the text area and this dot value, what we will do is we'll remove this, and here we will have a label. Inside the label I will say pick your favorite flavor. Okay, and now I will have a select box. So select then I will also pass in the options. Option value is equals to something. So let's say the first one is grapefruit because that's the value we have selected. And then let's say grapefruit. Let's close the option. Let's copy and paste this option so that we can change. Let's say we have apple, chocolate, banana, and let's just say we have 4 options. Okay, let me save that, and we should start seeing nothing on the screen because the flavor form is not yet used. Let's just put that to use by moving it into the content component. So just like SA component, we'll add the flavor form. Now that we have added the form, it should start reflecting on the screen as a drop down. Pick your favorite color or flavor. Now when I select the flavor, let's say chocolate, it should make the change, but nothing is happening, and nothing happens because I haven't yet handled the on change event. So I need to make sure on select I pass in the on change and this dot handle change. Let's close this, let's save it, and it should refresh again. And once it refreshes, let me change the chocolate flavor, and nothing happens yet because the button for the submit is not there. So let's just quickly add the button. Let's say input type is equals to submit and value is equals to submit. This is just another way of creating a button. Initially we saw it with the button tag, now we are seeing it with the input tag. So let me select the chocolate and then say submit. So this should give me an alert chocolate. Of course I can add more text to it, so I can just say the flavor you selected is and then we can have the value displayed. Let's just change this, chocolate, submit, and the flavor selected is chocolate. Of course, I can do anything with this value. I can just make it to an uppercase. Let's say to uppercase, save it, and it should also refresh. And whenever I select, the alerted value will always be in an uppercase versus the lowercase. You can see it's banana. Now that's just the value. You can of course handle the value and a key pair too. So that way you can display the value or probably store it in the database if you want to.